Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be presenting Laura Dykstra, who's going to be talking about her PhD research. And we'll have a brief introduction also by Lance McNew, who's her PhD advisor, and is the PI of the Wildlife Habitat Ecology Lab located in the Department of Animal and Range Sciences. So I don't want to steal the stage too long, except to say I'm really excited to hear what they have to share with us today. And with that, please, Lance.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. So before I introduce the main event for today, Madison asked if I'd provide a brief introduction to our lab, the Wildlife Habitat Ecology Lab, which is located in the Department of Animal and Range Sciences. So generally speaking, the lab does research on the spatial, population, and community ecology of wildlife in working landscapes, and with a specific focus on rangeland ecosystems. Looking around the room, I feel like my introduction is probably going to be a little bit remedial for you guys, but I didn't know who was going to show up. So first thing I wanted to talk about is, I get asked a lot when I'm going around the country and internationally, like when I talk about rangelands, folks want to know, well, what's a rangeland? And that's a good question. So there are lots of different definitions about what a rangeland is. I think most people, when they close their eyes and they envision a rangeland, they think of like these large expanses of grassland. Perhaps you might envision some charismatic critters, right? Or some charismatic people on these spaces as well. And you wouldn't be wrong. But in the lab, we prefer the ecological definition provided by the NRCS, and that is, rangeland is a land that's dominated by indigenous grass and grass-like or herbaceous vegetation, also with strong components of shrubs, and even a certain amount of trees, as long as the herbaceous category is dominant. But most importantly, what separates a rangeland from other ecosystems that we have is that they evolved with, they're created by, and they're maintained by ecological disturbances, primarily fire and grazing by large herbivores. Okay, so this northern mixed grass prairie that we see here is certainly a rangeland, but so are shrublands. So the shrub steppe of the Great Basin, African savannas are rangelands, high deserts, even wetlands, which are dominated by herbaceous vegetation, are classified as rangelands under this ecological definition. Even some woodlands, as long as that herbaceous vegetation type is dominant, and Arctic and alpine tundra are also rangeland ecosystems. So that makes rangelands collectively the most widespread and ubiquitous ecosystem type in the whole world. And that includes the Western United States. Here on this map, yellow indicates rangeland ecosystem types, according to the NRCS. But despite their ubiquitousness, rangelands are disappearing fast, and that's a global trend. And nowhere is that story more concerning than right here in our backyards in the Great Plains. So we've lost about 95% of all of our tall grass prairie. We've lost about 74% of mixed grass prairie, both southern and northern mixed grass prairie, and about half of our short grass prairie. So temperate grasslands are probably one of the most imperiled ecosystems in the whole world. And the hemorrhaging isn't over. We're still losing about 1 million acres per year in the Great Plains, our native grasslands. And that's concerning because rangelands offer immense values. All right, so on the ecosystem side of things, they provide clean water, they sequester carbon, they support biodiversity, and of course they provide a lot of open space for both critters and people who need that open space. But in addition, they provide a lot of social cultural value as well. So of course they produce food and fiber and immense amounts of recreational opportunity, which supports local communities, rural communities. All right. And even more importantly, they offer this, I guess, intrinsic or kind of undefined cultural sense of place that people living in these landscapes for tens of thousands of years have come to know and appreciate and need. But from our point of view in the lab, I guess our primary concern is that they also provide immense amounts of wildlife habitat. So in a recent inventory analysis conducted by my lab and co-authored by Laura recently, we identified more than 1,000 rangeland associated or dependent wildlife species that actually have to require rangeland habitats in the western United States alone, right? Concerningly, more than 16% of those that we identified are designated as species of conservation concern, either by the IUCN or by local, state, or federal governments, right? And 3% of the species that are rangeland dependent are actually listed as threatened or endangered. And these are just vertebrate wildlife species. I haven't talked about in all the innumerable invertebrates and fishes that also call these rangelands home. Unfortunately, we've seen rapid declines of grassland, specifically grassland-associated wildlife species, but also more broadly rangeland-associated and obligate wildlife species. This is indicated probably best by the rapid and precipitous decline of grassland birds, kind of our canaries in the coal mine of rangeland ecosystems over the last 60 years or so. All right. And these losses are primarily driven by the large-scale loss of intact temperate grasslands and shrublands. But even in areas that have remained relatively intact and native, we're still seeing pretty large and rapid declines in rangeland-associated wildlife. So why is that? Laura's going to tell us a little bit about that. But that brings us to kind of what the focus of our lab does. So we are focused on evaluating how rangeland management activities and those natural and perhaps artificial drivers of ecosystem processes define population and spatial and community ecology of wildlife species. We use a variety of model species to do this, but we're primarily focused on prairie grouse, which are these species in the bottom left-hand corner, which many have identified as indicator species because they require such diverse habitat conditions over their life history, which again, I think Laura will bring us to, including the sharp-tailed grouse. All right, so that's enough for me. So that brings us to our main event or main attraction for today, Laura Dykstra. All right, so Laura is a PhD candidate in the Department of Animal and Range Sciences, working on her doctorate in the multidisciplinary ecology and environmental sciences degree. Laura is from the Midwest originally, I think Ohio. She got her Master's of Science degree at the University of Connecticut, where she studied the movement, ecology, and breeding ecology of urban mallards. And if you think chasing sharp-tailed grouse across the rugged landscapes of western Montana is tough, try tracking mallards through East Coast suburbia. So she also got her bachelor's degree at Calvin University, which is in Michigan, where she was a Goldwater scholar. She's a very passionate and dedicated avian ecologist. She's not even finished her doctorate yet. She already has at least 8 peer-reviewed publications, ranging on a variety of taxa, from passerines to raptors to waterfowl. She's working on some manuscripts for grouse currently. And over a broad range of topics from movement ecology to breeding behavior to demography. So she's already making, without having her dissertation in hand or her doctorate in hand, she's already making large contributions to wildlife conservation and land management in this country. So without further ado, please help me welcome Laura Dykstra to the podium.
All right, well, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to share some of the work that we're doing on reintroducing sharp-tailed grouse to western Montana. Now, I wanted to start by talking about what are prairie grouse and why we should care about their conservation, which I think many people in the audience are familiar with already. But when I say prairie grouse, I'm referring to these 4 native species. These sharp-tailed grouse and sage grouse are in Montana, and the prairie chickens are found further south in the Great Plains. And these are all rangeland obligate species, so they require grassland or shrub steppe ecosystems to meet all of their life history needs. What is not a prairie grouse? If you hike a lot around Bozeman, you've probably flushed one of these 2 species and been very surprised by it. But dusky grouse and rough grouse are forest grouse and have different habitat needs than prairie grouse. So we will not be discussing them today. I'll be focusing on the sharp-tailed grouse, but we'll discuss prairie grouse in general when it's relevant. And so many of these prairie grouse species are declining throughout the United States. When we look at the sharp-tailed grouse, we have several subspecies in the US, but there are really only two we need to know for today. The Colombian sharp-tailed grouse, shown here in brown, which is found throughout the western US, or at least was historically, it now occupies only about 10% of its previous range. And then the plains sharp-tailed grouse in eastern Montana and the northern Great Plains, which is doing better than a lot of other prairie grouse. And when we talk about reintroducing sharp-tailed grouse to western Montana, we thought that the grouse historically in western Montana were that Colombian subspecies. And now we think they were the plains subspecies, and that will be important later on. And there are many threats to prairie grouse, mainly habitat loss and conversion, invasive annual grasses, altered fire regimes, conifer encroachment, and increasing development. But these are an economically important native game bird species. There are about 40,000 sharp-tailed grouse harvested annually in Montana, bringing in about 15 million. They're also deeply culturally significant to the indigenous people. Many tribes have dances inspired by the sharp-tailed grouse's elaborate mating display. And as Lance mentioned, prairie grouse, like the sharp-tailed grouse, require diverse grassland habitats. They have different needs across lekking, nesting, brood rearing, and overwintering, so they require these intact rangeland landscapes, which is why we often think of them as an indicator or a sentinel species. And we couldn't talk about sharp-tailed grouse without playing a video of them, which may work. We'll have to see. And I'd let us watch all 5 minutes, but if you want to see more, you'll have to go out to somewhere out, since they are just about starting to display on those legs. Hopefully I didn't mess up the slides for those watching online. But that being said, these are economically and culturally important birds, and they are just a cool species, which is why agencies have often done translocations to restore prairie grouse. When we talk about grouse translocation, that usually involves capturing birds at leks, transporting them, and then releasing them either at leks or artificial leks. And there's sometimes a monitoring component after that, which may be counting birds on leks or monitoring individuals, but that's inconsistent between projects. And the big thing to know for today is when we talk about reintroduction success, we need grouse to stay put and stick around those reintroduction sites. We need them to survive, and we need them to reproduce. So remember those three things. And so if you look at prairie grouse translocations and reintroductions that have been attempted, there are a lot of them. This table is only a small number of those. But these amount to thousands of grouse translocated across almost all of the western states. And the challenge is reintroduction success rates still remain low. Projects often fail. Birds leave the reintroduction sites, they fail to reproduce, they don't survive, often because they have inadequate habitat around their release site. So we have a lot of reintroduction failure, and this comes at a time where effective conservation action is critical to the persistence of many of these prairie grouse species. And so there's been many strategies proposed for improving translocation outcomes. These include things like matching habitat at capture leks to that at the release sites, modifying our trapping methods, minimizing capture, transport, and handling time, using release boxes and other soft release techniques, translocating females and their broods, and even captive rearing. But the challenge is many projects lack the post-release monitoring needed to figure out what that problem actually was and if the management intervention they took actually made a difference. So if you're not studying your reintroduction, you don't have a great chance of improving it. And that's why when Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks began efforts to reintroduce sharp-tailed grouse to Western Montana, we wanted to be involved and do research on that reintroduction to evaluate how we can use the ecology of these translocated grouse to improve reintroductions and what actions are actually needed to produce a viable grouse population. So we'll start with a little history of these sharp-tailed grouse in Montana. Grouse were historically found throughout Montana in northern mixed grass prairie on the east side of the state, and then in intermountain valleys on the west side of the state. In the 1800s, they were documented as abundant by Lewis and Clark, who are perhaps best known for their navigational skills than for their drawings of grouse. But our sharp-tail populations began declining in western Montana in the 1920s and the 1940s. At that time, there was a lot of development in the region. Additionally, the construction of the Libby Dam in 1973 flooded intermountain grasslands that were important to sharp-tailed grouse. And so there were some efforts to augment these declining populations. These included translocations to the National Bison Range and then to the Tobacco Valley in northwest Montana. This Tobacco Valley project included 100 males and 40 females translocated, and it did help these lek counts increase temporarily, but sharp-tailed grouse were still likely extirpated from western Montana by the early 2000s. And that's why in 2017, researchers from MSU completed a restoration plan for the sharp-tailed grouse in Montana. With that plan, they identified 3 valleys in western Montana that likely contain habitat that could be suitable for sharp-tailed grouse. They determined that the minimum viable population size is 280 grouse. That's the number of grouse you need to have a population that has a 95% probability of persistence over 50 years. So they developed a plan to translocate 180 sharp-tails per year for 5 years. And another important idea in a reintroduction is that you need to choose source populations that are similar in habitat and genetics to your release site. So because of this, recent genetic evidence has shown that the sharp-tailed grouse in western Montana historically were most similar to the plains sharp-tailed grouse in here in orange on the range. And because of that, that meant that we could use capture areas in eastern and central Montana for current reintroduction efforts. These are these stars. So grouse are captured at leks out here, and then they're translocated to sites in western Montana, including the Bitterroot Valley, which is just south of Missoula. It's a mix of agriculture, rangeland, and more residential and commercial development. We also translocated birds to the Blackfoot Valley and to Drummond, which are both primarily private cattle ranches. We added Drummond in 2025, so we'll not talk about that site too much today. And all of these valleys were within the historical range of the sharp-tailed grouse shown there in orange. We know that the Blackfoot Valley had one of the last remnant populations of sharp-tailed grouse in western Montana. We had leks documented in the Blackfoot Valley until about 3 decades ago. So translocations began in fall of 2021 with 75 males to start to establish these leks. And everyone is always most interested in how we actually catch grouse. We go out in central and eastern Montana to the leks, shown here. The grouse aren't here because it's afternoon. We set up this array of box traps and drift fencing so that when the grouse show up the next morning, they'll hopefully follow along that drift fencing and end up in the trap like this female here did. The grouse then get banded and fitted with a transmitter, and they're transported across the state on the day of their capture by a large team of volunteers willing to make that long drive. And then grouse are released either on the morning after or the afternoon of their capture. We release grouse either at artificial leks, or now that we have leks available, we release birds at those leks. And over the past 5 years, we've translocated 260 males and 398 females. So it takes a lot of birds for these reintroduction projects. And that, I always say, is the glamorous part of the story. If you Google sharp-tailed grouse reintroduction, you'll read a lot about the capture, the transport, and the release. But a lot of the things that I work on comes next. So after those birds have been released, my team and I will spend the summer tracking these birds. Some of our grouse get a VHF transmitter. That's a little tiny radio collar. And for those transmitters, we need to go out with our Yagi antenna and listen for those radio collar signals, meaning that you need to go out and take several bearings on the bird to get a location. And it can be challenging, depending on where your birds end up. We're also able to take advantage of GPS transmitters that are now available, and those collect a lot of locations and upload them via satellite or cellular networks. So you remember that we said for a reintroduction to be successful, grouse must stay put, they must survive, and they must reproduce. Today, I'm going to be focusing on grouse movements and how we can learn about those to improve reintroduction outcomes, but I'll highlight the other two where they come into the story. And so ideally in a reintroduction, you would hope that you release your grouse and then they stick around the reintroduction site so that you can start to get that population established. Is that what usually happens? Usually we release a female, and in those first couple of days or weeks, she's making longer movements. Each of these steps is several kilometers in length. And eventually that bird will switch over to shorter movements. She'll establish a home range, and they'll often nest within a month or so after release. And this is the daily distance move during that first month, which provides a good visualization of what these grouse are up to. We use a behavioral change point analysis to visualize this nicely. Here, that red track is the dispersal period when this grouse is moving a lot. And then that blue track is when she is settled and mostly making movements within that home range. So the general timeline of a grouse after translocation will be days to weeks spent dispersing. Then that bird will establish a home range, then hopefully nest and raise a brood. This is all done in habitat that is new to that female. And so why do we care so much about this dispersal period? In our first year of translocations, we released females in the Bitterroot Valley and the Blackfoot Valley. And those females did something like this. So they were moving up and down these valleys, and they were even getting up into those mountainous areas. One of those birds released in the Bitterroot Valley even made it over into Idaho. Some of those reached about 300 kilometers traveled in the 2 months following release. And that's actually pretty common in prairie grouse translocations. But unfortunately, it puts birds at high risk of mortality, especially when they're moving through areas that are not sharp-tailed grouse habitat. And for those of you who don't work with grouse every day, which maybe about half of you, a resident sharp-tailed grouse will not make these long-distance movements. They have high site fidelity, and they will use a home range that's usually only a couple hundred hectares in size. Occasionally, these resident birds will make some seasonal migrations or exploratory forays, but these are often less than 20 kilometers. So a grouse traveling several hundred kilometers is not a usual aspect of their biology. And that's probably why we often see low survival in the month after release for our translocated birds. This survival curve is one of our sites, and this is the first 100 days following release. And this low initial survival is not uncommon in a prairie grouse translocation. We have a lot of strategies proposed for reducing these dispersal movements and improving survival and reintroduction outcomes. But again, if we only have radio telemetry, it's very difficult to follow these birds when they're moving so far. And because of that, that period between when the birds are released and when they settle down somewhere has remained largely unknown. For example, this bird we looked at, if she just had a radio collar on, we likely would have found her when she was released and then when she started nesting, missing this whole period in between. So the ability to use these GPS transmitters has really enabled us to learn about what these birds are doing during that critical time period. And so we see that sharp-tailed grouse can move long distances after release, and we see that that period when they're dispersing can be a time of high mortality. So we wanted to know what is influencing how far sharp-tailed grouse are moving while dispersing. We had three hypotheses: that conspecific attraction, especially to males at leks, influences movement, that the availability of or proximity to nesting habitats influences movement, or that individual traits, especially those that affect the strength of site fidelity, influence movements. So with our first hypothesis, conspecific attraction is simply the idea that animals are attracted to others of their same species. These other animals can provide a good cue for habitat quality. And we often take advantage of this in reintroductions by putting out artificial birds. In our project, this would then follow that if we release birds near the lek, near those displaying males, they'll hopefully stick around. Whereas if we're releasing birds away from leks, they're likely to go off in search of males. And for this, we've mapped all of the leks at our reintroduction sites, shown there with the X, created a 400-meter buffer around them. And then we looked at the movements made by all these birds with GPS transmitters in the 72 hours after release. Here, each bird is a different color. And we calculated the proportion of locations for each of our birds that were within the lek buffer, which we call the lek encounter rates. We also know that lek sizes have changed from year to year and differ between our reintroduction sites, so we also thought that that may be important. Next, we hypothesized that birds would need to locate habitat after translocation. Many sharp-tailed grouse are bred by the time they arrive at the reintroduction site and need to locate nesting habitat, which for a sharp-tailed grouse is usually fields with perennial bunch grasses. Essentially, you need enough grass, shrub, or other vegetation to provide concealment for that nesting female. So in a similar way, if we release birds near this nesting habitat, they may stay around and hopefully nest quickly. If you release them far from nesting habitat, they may go off and have to move long distances to locate that nesting habitat. And over the years of our project, we found 120 nests at our reintroduction site. And we used kernel density estimation to create a heat map of those nest locations. We took the 50% contour of that, that's the red line. We call that our nesting areas. Here, the triangles are our release sites, and we calculated a nesting area attraction score for each release site. And this is based off the distance to the nesting areas, as well as the KDE rate of those nesting areas. Just like we did for the Lex, we also took our nesting areas, those red outlines. We took our bird movement tracks, and we looked at the proportion of locations within a nesting area for each bird, which we called our nest encounter rates. And finally, for our third hypothesis, sharp-tailed grouse have high site fidelity. And this site fidelity is disrupted when you translocate them across the states. We expect that yearling birds who have had less time to develop site fidelity to that original home may be more likely to accept new habitat conditions at the release site and stick around relative to adult birds. Habitat familiarity may also be important. Grouse have high natal habitat preference. So if you have a reintroduction site that's mostly grassland, let's say you capture a grouse in grassland and translocate that bird to your grassland reintroduction site, that female may be more familiar with that habitat and more likely to accept it and stick around. Versus if you were to capture a bird in habitat that looks a lot more different, like somewhere more shrub dominated. You'd expect that bird to possibly make these long distance movements in search of somewhere that looks more like home to them. And why do we care so much about this? For our project, we have grouse captured at Lex, surrounded by cropland, grassland, shrubland. And the grouse are translocated to sites that look, even a little bit more different from any of those. So we looked at land cover around those captured Lex and around those release sites, used a principal component analysis. These are our source Lex and our release sites. And you can see that that is pretty much a gradient between our more shrub dominated and our more grass dominated sites. So for each female, we calculated a habitat familiarity index based on the distance from that capture lek to the release site in the PCA space. So we return to our original question. What influences how far grouse move while dispersing? We had our three hypotheses, and we also thought that movements may differ between our reintroduction sites. What did we find? Grouse released in the Bitterroot Valley, that's our more developed site south of Missoula, were moving almost twice as far compared to those released in the Blackfoot Valley. Additionally, birds that were spending more time in those nesting areas soon after release ultimately moved shorter distances. And things like lek encounters, age, and habitat familiarity were less influential, which suggests that we really need to prioritize releasing these sharp-tails near nesting areas. However, even the ones we released near nesting areas still moved long distances in those weeks following release. So we also wanted to know how are grouse interacting with the landscape while dispersing, and how can we use that to improve reintroductions? Based on what we know about sharp-tailed grouse, we hypothesized that grassland and shrubland would facilitate movement, that mountains and forests constrain movement, prairie grouse species often avoid conifers, and that leks and nesting habitat would drive where grouse ultimately chose to settle and establish their home range. And if you look at our valleys, we have the Blackfoot and the Bitterroot. Both of those valleys are grassland and shrubland surrounded by evergreen forest and mountains. So we'd expect the lands cover here to influence where birds are going after they are released. And so we looked a little bit more closely at this dispersal period. We used the hidden Markov model to split this track into two behavioral states. I'll zoom in there a bit. We have two states. We have an encamp state where your grouse is taking shorter steps and making more non-directed movement. And then we have an exploratory state. That's that one shown in blue, where grouse are taking longer steps and they're making more directed movements. And our grouse are pretty much switching between these two behavioral states while they are dispersing. And we thought that habitat selection might differ based on what behavioral state that bird was in. In that exploratory state where the grouse is making larger steps, that bird might be selecting just for large areas of grassland or shrubland. When the bird is in that encamp state and making more smaller and non-directed steps, she may be looking for preferred grass, forb, and shrub cover on that smaller, more local scale. So we use an integrated step selection analysis, where essentially we take the used steps made by the bird and we pair them with available steps, those dashed lines, which is where the bird could have gone. We do this for the exploratory state and the encamp state. And we take these used and available steps and we look at habitat covariance and multiple spatial scales for each step. And these are things we expected to be important to grouse, like tree cover, grassland or shrublands cover, or development in the area. And we're comparing these used and available steps within each state. And ultimately, for grouse in the exploratory state, those birds taking longer directed steps, we find that they are selecting areas with more grassland and shrubland on that more landscape scale. They're also choosing to take these steps to ends closer to nesting areas. But it's different for grouse in the encamp state, grouse making those more localized movements. We find that they're selecting steps ending with more perennial cover and more shrub cover on a much more local scale. So we see differences in habitat selection based on what behavioral state that grouse is currently in. And if you look back to this figure, on the bottom right is the behavioral states that the grouse is in, and it's basically alternating between those two. But we're really interested in what's happening when that grouse is in the exploratory state and it's switching over to that encamp state temporarily, or when that grouse is temporarily stopping for a couple hours to a day or two. And so if we take all of our grouse movement tracks and we plot those points here in yellow, again, this is where our birds have stopped for a little bit. We wanted to compare those to where the birds actually ended up and chose to settle and establish a home range. Those are shown in blue in the Blackfoot and pink in the Bitterroot. We wanted to know how these differ. How do grouse choose what will be their final settlement location? So we compared these, and we find that grouse are choosing to ultimately settle and establish their home ranges in areas in the foothills, not way up in the mountains, in landscapes with few trees, and then near nesting areas. The interesting thing is that grouse also ended up close together, often near where we had released them and where we had leks established. So we see that grouse are often making these long distance movements after release. They're selecting for grassland and shrubland on these exploratory steps. And many of them are ending up together at nesting areas near where they were released, even though they've gone a lot of other places first. But how does that fit into overall reintroduction success? Remember, we care about whether grouse are staying at those sites, surviving, and reproducing. So we've done 3 years of translocations and we've monitored 332 females during that time. What have we learned? Are grouse staying put? This is 2023 movements, which we saw earlier. And then we can look at where grouse went in 2024 and 2025. And grouse are still moving long distances after translocation in all years. In the Bitterroot Valley, this averages out to 27 days of dispersal. In the Blackfoot Valley, it's closer to 10 days. So these movements are persisting. However, many grouse are returning to nesting areas near release sites. So maybe they are kind of staying put, but in a more complicated way, where there's a lengthy process involved in that. And these birds that end up settling and establishing a home range account for about 1/3 of all birds released. Which brings us to our next point. Are grouse surviving? We lose many of our grouse during that initial month or 2 after they're released, when birds are dispersing. But once birds make it to a month or 2 after they're released, then breeding season survival seems relatively typical for sharp-tailed grouse. And these grouse that survive, many of them will nest. We've monitored 120 nests and 70 broods in our area. This pink image is thermal imagery of 2 older chicks. We get to break out the drone to help us monitor. So we've calculated our vital rates for reproduction, and we can compare them to established resident populations of sharp-tailed grouse. And we find that our translocated birds have nest and brood survival that's pretty typical for grouse, which is a great sign in a reintroduction. And this is very important because your chicks born at the reintroduction site often have similar survival and reproduction to residents. They also have site fidelity to that reintroduction site. So if we put all the pieces together, our hope is that if we can reduce this excessive dispersal and increase the amount of birds that stay put, we can hopefully improve that initial survival, which would mean that more birds are able to nest and hopefully more chicks are produced at the reintroduction sites. But how can we use movement to do this? We know that even when we release grouse near established leks and nesting areas, many of them still make these long movements. However, it may still be valuable to release them here because we have some evidence that grouse that are able to interact with these nesting areas soon after release ultimately move shorter distances. And it seems like many of our birds will return to these leks and nesting areas after their movements. So early establishment of these leks and nesting areas is critical to reintroduction progress. In our project, we've seen that movements and survival have remained relatively similar across the 3 years of the reintroduction. So year 1 can provide a valuable benchmark for reintroduction progress. And finally, we also need to consider how grouse are navigating on that landscape scale and then on that local scale when we're selecting our reintroduction sites. And I'll end with, if you only remember 3 things from this presentation, it is this. We know that reintroductions are challenging. We're up against a long history of prairie grouse translocation failures. But if we are monitoring and we are learning from these reintroductions, we have a better chance of improving our ongoing reintroduction efforts and providing recommendations for future translocations. We also see that sharp-tailed grouse depend on having these large intact landscapes. In the Bitterroot Valley, which has become a lot more developed, we see grouse making long movements, likely in search of habitat. It seems unlikely that we'll be able to have a population established there. But at the same time, there are sites in western Montana that seem like they're still able to support sharp-tailed grouse. In the Blackfoot Valley, which is mostly working cattle ranches, we have a lot of landowners who are invested in the conservation of these birds. Our next step is to see if we have the fine-scale habitat needed to meet all of their life stage requirements. And finally, it's important to let bird movements tell us what to do. We can use year one as a guide, and we can release birds near leks and nesting areas where previous birds have been before them. Ultimately, the future of our reintroductions depends on careful monitoring of birds that we are released and making efforts to learn. Future reintroductions also depend on having a large team of people who are invested in making these successful. And with that, I'd like to thank Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, MPG Ranch, the Wildlife Habitat Ecology Lab and Montana State University, and all of our dedicated landowners, volunteers, and technicians. And I want to thank you all for being here on your Wednesday before spring break. And if we have time, I can take any questions.